Shaka Senghor is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, Righting My Wrongs: Life, Death, and the Redemption in an American Prison, and a leading voice in criminal justice reform movement. Please welcome Shaka Senghor.
January 2015, I went to meet my sister for lunch at around 2 p.m. That lunch turned into a marathon session of drinking, loud music, and more drinking. Around 2 a.m., I got into my car to leave the last place where we were drinking at. I was well over the legal limit for alcohol consumption. In fact, I was extremely drunk. But I got in my truck anyway. It was pouring down raining, and I remember seeing what I thought was the entrance to the expressway. And when I turned on it, I quickly realized that it was the exit because all I saw coming toward me were the headlights of a car. I veered to the right, drove up on the embankment, avoiding a collision, navigated my way down the ramp, turned into traffic to turn the car around, and began to drive home. As I drove home, I said a prayer that if I found my way out of this, I would never allow that to happen again. Fortunately for me and for the other drivers, that story didn't have a traumatic end. But in order for you to understand why this story is so important, let me take you back to the beginning. 1986, I ran away from an abusive home. I was an honor roll scholarship student with all the potential in the world. Shortly after running away from home, I found myself deeply entrenched in the crack cocaine trade. I experienced every imaginable horror that comes with that culture. My childhood friend was murdered. I was robbed at gunpoint and beat nearly to death. 3 years later, at the age of 17, on March 8, 1990, I got shot multiple times standing on the corner of my block. I was rushed to the hospital, patched up, 2 of the bullets extracted, and sent right back to my neighborhood. No one asked me how I felt, what I thought, and not one person thought to offer what I believe is a universal expression of compassion and empathy, a simple hug. So I returned to my community with all the symptoms of PTSD that's prevalent in inner cities across the nation. 16 months later, July 1991, I found myself in a conflict. But this time I fired first. I fired several shots, tragically ending a man's life. I was subsequently arrested, charged with open murder, and sentenced to 17 to 40 years in prison for second-degree murder. When I entered prison, I was bitter, I was angry, and I found myself getting in more and more trouble. By the time 1999 rolled around, I was being sentenced to 2 additional years in prison and what turned out to be 4.5 years in solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is arguably the most barbaric and inhumane space that we can claim in our country. Thank you. During my time in solitary confinement, I saw some of the most egregious abuses known to mankind. I saw a level of desperation that most people can never imagine. In fact, one guy would cut himself just so he can go to the hospital and feel the touch of another human being patching him up. While I was in solitary confinement, I discovered the skill set of writing. I began a journal. And I began to discover that I had never accomplished anything in my life, so I challenged myself to write a book. And I challenged myself to write a book in 30 days or less. Clearly, I wasn't that smart back then. But I eventually got that book done. I was released from solitary confinement in 2004, and I began a pathway toward preparing for life after prison. In 2008, I went up for parole for the first time, and I was denied. 2009, I went back up, parole board hearing was a little bit better, but I was denied that second time. Finally, on June 22nd, 2010, after serving a total of 19 years in prison, 7 in solitary confinement, I was released from prison. When I walked out of the door, I heard the same conversation that Ms. Burton heard. Officer told me that I'll be back in 6 months. Initially, I was very upset, and I wanted to lash out, but getting on the other side of freedom was a little bit more important, so I remained calm. But I began to understand why he said those words. The reality is 70% of men and women who are incarcerated will return back to prison. And largely because we don't have the structures in place to ensure that men and women return home healthy and whole. But instead of returning to prison in 6 months, here's what actually happened. When I got out, I knew I had a responsibility to mentor other young men and women in my community who were on a similar path that led to me being in prison. For that work, I won an award called the Be Me Leadership Award, even though they said I would be back in prison in 6 months. Thank you. I followed that award up with a fellowship to MIT Media Lab, where I started a project called the Atonement Project, which was nominated for a $1 million Global TED Prize. Clearly I didn't win, because I probably wouldn't be up here right now. I have some other things to do. Later on that year, I began to teach at the University of Michigan, where I've taught for 3 semesters. I don't have an associate's degree, master's degree, bachelor's degree, PhD. I had a GED and always showed up with fly kicks to teach, even though they said I would be back in prison in 6 months. In 2014, I received a fellowship with Kellogg, even though they said I would be back in prison in 6 months. In 2015, I won an Innovator of the Year award at Manchester University, even though they said I would be back in prison in 6 months. And then 2015 got really interesting when I got this phone call. And the woman asked me, she said, "Shaka, what does your schedule look like in June?" I said, "Well, it's pretty flexible." And then she hung up the phone. And then she called me back the next day and she said, "Shaka, I apologize for hanging up. I was in a rush, but I asked about your schedule because Ms. Winfrey would love to interview you later on in June, if you're available." I said, "Well, let me look into this, check my availability." Several months later, Ms. Winfrey went on to write that not only was our interview one of the best in her career, but it was one of the best in her life. She then went on to text me, because you know, Oprah be texting me, you know what I mean? And she told me that not only was it one of the best in her life, but it was in her top 5. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. Because they said I would be back in prison in 6 months. March of 2016, my memoir, Righting My Wrongs, Life, Death, and Redemption in an American Prison, debuted on the New York Times bestseller list 26 years after the day I got shot standing on that corner. Even though they said I would be back in prison in 6 months. February of 2017, I had a really interesting encounter when I had an opportunity to meet former President Barack Obama. I remember walking in the room and looking at this man who represented a beacon of hope for so many. And the first thing he said is, I heard you wrote a book. And I was like, yeah, I did. He was like, so the president can't get a book? And I'm like, of all the days I don't have a book, this cat asked me for a book. The end of 2017, I was commissioned to write a play for the Geffen Playhouse in Los Angeles, even though they said I would be back in prison in 6 months. So why does this all matter? It matters because on that day 2 years ago, I didn't realize that I was dealing with compounded PTSD. And had I had that head-on collision, not only could I tragically ended another life, but I would never been able to accomplish many of the things that I'm able to accomplish today. But more importantly, it's important because every week, 10,000 men and women are released from prison who are dealing with complex PTSD. It is one of the most grave injustices that we are dealing with in our country. It is what I call the silent crisis, because I wasn't aware in that moment that my attempt to mask the hurt and pain was really my own way of addressing my trauma, because we don't have therapy available to men and women coming home from prison. I personally believe that in this room, right now in this moment, that we have the men and women power capable of making the reality that I face very different from somebody else. Thank y'all for y'all time.